All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly, highly ambitious piece of legislation that could fundamentally alter how the United States manages its national wealth. You know, proponents are framing this whole debate with some seriously patriotic motifs. Picture this: the U.S. Capitol dome forged out of digital granite, backed by this glowing, rising orange sun. It's a striking image, right? And it perfectly captures their main argument. They're saying, look, America is modernizing, but we are also staring down the barrel of a staggering $39 trillion national debt. So how do you modernize the country's balance sheet and actually shield the next generation from all that financial baggage? Well, that is the exact question a new 2026 bill is attempting to answer.
Okay, let's dive into this. The rallying cry for this proposed legislation is pretty straightforward, but it's bold. No new taxes, just anchoring the dollar to stored thermodynamic work. Now, the core idea here is kind of revolutionary, even though it relies on a very old-school financial concept, budget-neutral accounting. The folks pushing this are arguing for a system that doesn't cost the taxpayer a dime. Instead, they want to anchor a chunk of the nation's wealth to something they argue literally cannot be politically manipulated. When they say stored thermodynamic work, they're talking about the massive computational energy that secures the Bitcoin network. To supporters, it's a monetary system governed purely by math. It's not run by a committee that can just, stretch the money supply whenever times get tough.
So what's the actual mechanism making this happen? It's called the American Reserve Modernization Act, or ARMA. Introduced in May 2026 by Republican Representative Nick Begich and Democratic Representative Jared Golden, this bipartisan bill has one very specific, very crucial goal. You might remember that earlier, in March 2025, an executive order established a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But here's the catch: an executive order can be scrapped by the next president with a single stroke of a pen. ARMA is designed to take that executive policy and cement it straight into permanent federal law. By giving it statutory footing, it makes the reserve incredibly difficult to dismantle. It basically takes digital assets out of the realm of executive whim and locks them directly into the bedrock of U.S. financial law.
And this brilliantly illustrates the genius mechanism of the bill. How do you actually pay for this without taxing the public? Well, the U.S. Treasury currently holds over 8,100 metric tons of physical gold. But right now, on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, those gold certificates are booked at a statutory price of $42.22 per ounce. Yes, you heard that right. That price was frozen all the way back in 1973. Meanwhile, the current market price of gold is soaring past $4,500 an ounce today. So ARMA proposes an accounting maneuver. They want to revalue those dormant gold certificates to match current market realities. They aren't physically selling off the nation's gold, they're simply updating a 5-decade-old ledger entry so it actually reflects reality.
By correcting that, let's call it an accounting fiction. This move unlocks an absolutely staggering number: $1.17 trillion. That is latent balance sheet strength just sitting completely dormant in the Treasury right this second. The ARMA bill dictates that this newly realized paper surplus would be used to fund the acquisition of Bitcoin. This is exactly what analysts mean when they call the proposal budget neutral. It basically converts an analog-era wealth storage mechanism into digital-era acquisition capital. So theoretically, the government could build this massive new reserve without adding a single cent to the national deficit. No new taxpayer dollars required. Pretty clever, right?
Now, the scale of this proposed acquisition is massive. ARMA authorizes the Treasury to acquire up to 200,000 Bitcoin per year for 5 years. That puts the target at a total reserve of 1 million Bitcoin. Just to put that into perspective, that is roughly 5% of the total global supply that will ever exist. Crucially, the bill institutes a strict minimum 20-year lockup period. Also, and this is a big one, the U.S. government currently has a habit of auctioning off crypto that gets seized in criminal investigations via the U.S. Marshals. ARMA puts an immediate halt to that. It dictates that all seized digital assets bypass the auction block entirely and go straight into a newly created digital asset stockpile. And yes, it comes complete with strict quarterly proof of reserve audits to ensure absolute transparency.
And that brings us to what the U.S. already has in its back pocket: 328,000. That's the estimated number of Bitcoin currently sitting in scattered U.S. government wallets right now. It's largely accumulated from major law enforcement seizures, things like the Silk Road takedown or the Bitfinex hack recovery. At current market prices, that stockpile is already worth well over $25 billion. ARMA would instantly consolidate all these fragmented holdings under unified, highly secure treasury management. We're talking about the geographic distribution of private keys across air-gap facilities, multi-signature governance, the whole shebang. It's honestly some of the most technically detailed custody language we've ever seen written into a congressional bill. Now, what's really interesting about this quote is how the bill's sponsors are presenting it to the public. They are leaning heavily into foundational American ideals. They're framing this, quite neutrally mind you, as an extension of private property rights into the digital sphere. The bill explicitly protects the rights of regular Americans to own and self-custody their digital assets. But the bigger macro argument here, the real why this matters, is that this reserve acts as a debt reduction shield. They are positioning this digital asset as a modern, fortified tool to protect the next generation from the crushing weight of the nation's liabilities.
To really understand why sponsors view Bitcoin as that shield, we have to look at how they contrast analog and digital monetary systems. On one side, they argue fiat currency is fundamentally ruled by committees. You've got the Fed, the Treasury, banking loan boards, and whenever the system is under severe stress, it has to be restructured. Think about how the money supply was massively expanded during the 2008 recession, or, more recently, the COVID pandemic. On the flip side, they point to Bitcoin, which operates under entirely different rules. Proponents emphasize its foundation of thermodynamic work and algorithmic closure, specifically that hard cap of 21 million coins. Their argument? You simply cannot print more to bail out a bad policy. They're framing this as a historic shift from trusting fallible human committees to trusting verifiable mathematics.
Let's zoom out a bit and see how this builds into a much larger global narrative. Looking at the geopolitical chessboard, the United States is actually already the largest known sovereign holder, with those 328,000 Bitcoin, though, as of right now, without a unified policy. China is sitting on an estimated 190,000, and the UK holds about 61,000, both currently without official policies. El Salvador, of course, has an active state portfolio of just over 6,000. If ARMA passes, the US goes from being a passive holder of seized assets to the very first major superpower to formally treat Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset, right on par with gold and oil. It's a move that completely changes the calculus for every single central bank currently watching from the sidelines.
Now, arguably, the most vital safeguard in this entire legislation is that 20-year lockup provision. By structurally locking away what could potentially be 5% of the global Bitcoin supply for 2 full decades, it essentially ties the hands of future politicians. It prevents them from liquidating the reserve to cover short-term budget shortfalls or just to score quick political points. It enforces extreme fiscal discipline. The legislation clearly states that after that 20-year lockup expires, any sales can only be used for one singular, highly specific purpose: paying down a $39 trillion national debt. It explicitly links the future appreciation of this digital asset directly to the eventual solvency of the American balance sheet.
So the crucial point is that this legislation fits into much broader, shifting geopolitical tides. According to analysts and our sources, we're witnessing a sort of dual-track evolution right now. On one hand, US dollar-backed stablecoins are successfully extending the reach of the digital dollar worldwide, which really reinforces its network effect. But simultaneously, Bitcoin is emerging as a globally neutral settlement asset. The sources highlight real-world examples, like shipping companies in geopolitical hotspots reportedly looking to Bitcoin to settle insurance frameworks completely outside of traditional confiscatable banking channels. Proponents see it as pure, neutral money. It can't be censored by any single government, making it an incredibly attractive reserve asset in what is becoming a very fractured world.
Which brings us to our final thought. The ARMA bill represents a profound ideological shift. It's treating digital scarcity as a literal matter of national security. But let's be real, it faces a very tough road ahead. It has to navigate genuine institutional resistance, survive endless committee reviews, and ultimately secure a presidential signature. Will this digital Bunker Hill survive the gauntlet of Washington politics? And if it actually does, will it fundamentally alter what the world considers a safe haven reserve asset for the next century? It's a massive development that could dictate the future of global finance, and it is absolutely something you should be watching closely. Thank you for joining this explainer, and keep learning.